This morning, I'd like to share with you a topic which I call the common cold of emotions. I call it the common cold because it's so common. We've all gone through it, we've all experienced it, we all have this in common. At one time or another, to some degree or another, we have been depressed. Three Old Testament personalities are associated with miracles. They were Moses, Elijah, and Elisha. And we hold these individuals up as being mighty heroes of the faith, and so they were. But they all had their own problems also, and they weren't immune to the common cold of emotions, depression. You've been there. You felt so low at one point that you had to look up to see bottom. You were feeling like you were the cartoon character that was constantly under a cloud that was raining. The sun has disappeared and has been replaced by darkness. The dictionary definition of depression is very revealing. A state of extreme dejection, morbidly excessive melancholy, a mood of hopelessness and feeling of inadequacy, a mood which may lead to physical symptoms producing a reduction in vitality, vigor, and spirits. In other words, it's not a happy place to be, either for yourself or for those around you. We've all gotten up on the wrong side of the bed with a case of the grumpies, but that usually wears off after the first or maybe the second cup of coffee. The depression we're looking at this morning is deeper and longer lasting. It's mental, it's emotional, it's spiritual, and it has physical consequences. It goes beyond a feeling blah to wanting to escape, and it sometimes even becomes suicidal. Severe cases of depression may lead to being institutionalized, and that's what should happen if the need is that great. Generally, with some help and a change of circumstances, we can work our way out of being depressed. The fact that spiritual giants have had depression and were able to recover it should give us encouragement. So let's look at the instance of Elijah. Let's see for ourselves what Elijah did, for we read that Elijah was a man just like us. Elijah burst onto the scene of ancient Israel with no introduction at all. We don't know his parents, we don't know anything about his background. He immediately became the focus of attention because his message criticized the king. He said, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." And the reason for this, given elsewhere, was the sinful condition of the country. King Ahab had no regard for the religious heritage of the country. He had adopted the vile practices of the neighboring religions. His wife Jezebel was even more notorious than the king. She was a foreigner, and she promoted the practice of Baal worship. Baal was a fertility god who promised his worshipers prosperity. By the standards of Israel's God, Baal worship was immoral, unethical, and vile. It promoted living and enjoying life now, denying yourself nothing. And when combined with Jewish worship, which taught a disciplined life and a heaven afterlife, when you combine the two, you have everything you want now and an afterlife. What could be better than that? Who wouldn't want that? But that's where the God of Israel stepped in and made this announcement about rain. Dry farming was the agricultural practice, meaning crops were dependent upon rain rather than irrigation. Lack of rain meant scant crops and hardships or even death for animals and humans. So this was shaping up to be a struggle, a war, if you please, between the God of Israel and Baal. Baal, the god of Ahab. It was Baal, the god depicted with a thunderbolt to demonstrate his power over rain, versus the creator God of Israel. By this time, Elijah has been in hiding for months and enjoying God's protection. But he is told to present himself to King Ahab and arrange a confrontation between the adherents of Baal and the prophets of God. Ahab rallies his priests at the appointed time on Mount Carmel on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Meanwhile, Elijah challenges the Israelites. How long will you waver between two opinions? If God is God, serve him. But if Baal is God, serve him. And I trust you know the story of the dramatic confrontation between God and Baal. Briefly, the Baal worshippers have the first chance to demonstrate the power of their God. A stone altar is constructed on the mountain, and wood was placed on it, and a bull was set to be offered on it. The condition was that the particular God with a capital G, or God with a small g, was to send fire to consume the sacrifice on the altar. And the prophets of Baal started their ritual about mid-morning and continued until noon. Nothing. No response from Baal. Elijah began to taunt them. The prophets continued into the afternoon, but there was no result. At 3 p.m., when the evening sacrifice was being offered in the Jerusalem temple, Elijah took his turn. First, he invited the people to come forward, and then he rebuilt a previous altar on that site because it lay in ruins from disuse. Wood was placed on the altar, and then Elijah did something unusual. He dug a trench around the altar. The sacrifice was laid out on the altar all ready to go, and Elijah did something really weird. He requested that 4 large jars of water be poured on the sacrifice, the wood, and the altar itself. And that ritual was repeated 2 more times. 12 large jars of water poured on the sacrifice until not only the sacrifice, but the wood and the altar itself were saturated, and the trench around the altar was full of water. The drought has lasted 3.5 years by this time, and water is a precious commodity. Probably this water was hauled up the hill from the Mediterranean Sea, and this soggy sacrifice placed the God of Israel at a tremendous disadvantage. When all was in place, Elijah prayed that the God of Abraham would demonstrate to Israel that he was God, and that Israel would turn their hearts back to him. We read in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 38, "Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water that was in the trench." At this demonstration, the people bowed and cried out, "The Lord, he is God! The Lord, he is God!" And the prophets of Baal are disposed of, and Ahab is told to go home, for there's a sound of heavy rain approaching. The contest is over. Baal has been defeated. The victor has been acclaimed by the crowd. The fire that fell was no ordinary fire, to which everyone could attest. Normally, it would take time for the sacrifice and the wood to dry out to make it combustible. But not only was the sacrifice burned, but the soil, the stone, and even the water in the trench was burned up. It's been suggested that this was not just fire, that possibly this was a laser beam. Elijah climbs to the top of the mountain to await the rain which he knows is coming. Because a rainstorm typically comes across the Mediterranean going east, Elijah sent his servant to look for signs of the approaching rain. The servant reported back that nothing was visible. 7 times the servant looked before seeing a small cloud the size of a man's fist rising from the sea. Ahab was told to leave before the rain made the roads impassable. We read, "Meanwhile, the sky grew black with clouds. The wind rose, a heavy rain came on, and Ahab rode off to Jezreel. The power of the Lord came upon Elijah, and Tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. So for a distance of about 17 miles, Elijah kept pace with chariot horses. I wonder how old he was. Now, if this was a fairy tale, we would say the drought was finally over, the God of Israel was established as supreme, the people returned to worship the God of Israel, and everyone lived happily ever after. But the Bible is not a fairy tale. It deals with the real nitty-gritty of life. So, wait, there's more. While the victory seems decisive, not everyone was on the mountain that afternoon. King Ahab gets home and he tells his wife Jezebel all that happened, and she is not pleased. She couldn't accept what happened. Deities in that day were often believed to be associated with certain nations, and she would tolerate the idea that the God of Israel was superior to the God of her native country. She would not, never. She was raised to believe in Baal, and she was ardent in her belief. If Elijah was the champion of Israel's God, she would be the champion of Baal. And as her prophets had suffered defeat and had been eliminated, so Elijah would have to die. A messenger was sent to Elijah. The message contained this threat from Jezebel. May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of my prophets. And hearing her intent, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Now Elijah had stood alone as the only prophet of God on Mount Carmel. He had experienced God's protection for several years of the drought. And now he runs from a woman. What's going on? On the mountain, he said that what he did was by God's command. But God hadn't told him about this. And when the ordeal on the mountain was over, he thought he was done. He hadn't anticipated this. Rather than standing up to her in the name and the power of God, he focused on the problem. His life was in danger. What should he do? Run! And so he did. Elijah had hope, or expected, that the conclusion of the crowd on the mountain would be accepted by the royal house of the northern kingdom of Israel. He had anticipated repentance, but instead is met with a death threat. Knowing Jezebel's reputation, he knew she was serious, deadly serious. If Elijah was able to run in front of Ahab's chariot, you should see him run now. From close to Dan, the northernmost city of Israel, to Beersheba, the southernmost city, is a distance of about 270 miles. And not satisfied with that, Elijah not only went to Beersheba, but continued on another day's journey south. And finally, exhausted, he rests in the shade of a desert shrub that hardly makes any shade. He's totally alone now. He left his servant in Beersheba. So what does he do? Well, what would you do? He threw himself a party, a pity party. You know what that is. You've thrown them for yourself. He invited only 3 people to his party, me, myself, and I. And what did the party consist of? Lamenting the situation. I don't deserve this. I thought I'd done everything right. I was obedient to God, and look what it's gotten me, a death threat. I wear myself out serving God, and that for someone wants to kill me. Life's not fair. It's not fair. I think I'll eat a worm. Been there? If you say no, I would question your truthfulness. Depression. How did Elijah get there? Well, let's look at some factors. What control did Elijah have over his circumstances? He couldn't control Jezebel's death threat, but he could choose how he responded to it. Did he make a wise choice? Did he stop to ask guidance from the Lord? What should he do? Was it the Lord that told him to run south? I don't think so. And when he got to his self-appointed destination, he prayed that he might die. If that's what he truly wanted, why did he run? Supposedly, that was what he was running from. But he's not alone. Job prayed the same thing, Job chapter 3. So did the prophet Jeremiah, Jeremiah chapter 20. And also the prophet Jonah, who told God it would be better for him to die than to live. God didn't take any of them at their word. And you may have felt that way too at some point, and yet there you are. When you felt that way, did you exaggerate your circumstances? Did you assume too much responsibility for yourself? Were you even thinking clearly? Were you thinking about anyone besides yourself? When Elijah was ready to give up on himself, God took over. First, God saw to his physical needs. Elijah got some rest and sleep. Think of what he's been through these last few days. An initial confrontation with King Ahab, who called him an enemy and a troubler of Israel, that all-day contest with the prophets of Baal, a death threat from a nasty queen who had every intention of fulfilling her threat, and a hasty journey of almost 300 miles on foot. We can agree with Martin Luther, who said, the most godly thing a tired man can do is rest. So God sent an angel to provide a meal for Elijah. And then after Elijah rested again, a second meal was provided. He was told, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. And then Elijah traveled another 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai are both said to be the places where the Ten Commandments were given. These mountains are both part of the same mountain range and close in proximity. Only when Elijah feels safe and secure does the Lord ask him a question. What are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah tells God about his frustrations. Is telling God your frustrations a good thing to do? Or should you keep that to yourself? Note that God doesn't criticize Elijah for feeling the way he does. And oftentimes it's a good thing to get some of that off your chest. So Elijah reviews the situation. He reminds God that he has been faithful and that his reward is a death threat. Besides, because of Jezebel, who has been killing the prophets of God, he is the only prophet left in the nation. And God's response is to tell Elijah that the Lord is about to pass by. Elijah moves to the mouth of the cave where he is staying to observe this event. There came a great and mighty wind that tore the mountain apart and shattered the rocks. But there was no message from the Lord in the wind. There followed an earthquake, but there was no message of God in the earthquake. And then came a fire, but again, no message from the Lord. And all of these events are supernatural means that God is used to gain man's attention, but not today. And then finally there came a still small voice, a gentle whisper that could barely be heard. It was a great contrast to everything that preceded it. The voice asked the same question a second time, because Elijah hadn't answered it the first time. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah repeats the same song and dance, reviewing his circumstance and ending up with a threat on his life. But at least now Elijah is listening. And then the Lord gave Elijah the direction that he needed. Go back the way you came. You're at the wrong place. God is implying that he did not send Elijah to where Elijah is at now. Those 300 miles you went south, Elijah, retrace them to where you started. I want you in Damascus, not here. I want you to anoint a king. I want you to anoint your own successor. Oh, and by the way, you're not alone. There are still 7,000 in Israel who are loyal to me and have not played up to Baal. Wow. Elijah is given new information, replacing the obsolete information on which Elijah had been acting. The people you anoint will take care of Ahab and Jezebel. Your work will continue through the prophet that you anoint. Everything is under control, and you are included in my plans. What if God had honored Elijah's request offered under that juniper bush? Just take my life. We can be glad that God is in control, and we are not. The emotions Elijah felt are common to all of us. He was afraid, verse 3. He was fatigued, needing food, water, and rest, verse 4. He had low self-esteem and felt guilty, verse 4. He was discouraged, verses 10 and 14. He was frustrated and needed a new vision from God, verses 11 through 13. He needed a purpose to continue on, verses 15 and 16. He needed assurance of victory, verse 17. He needed new and correct information to update his obsolete information, verse 18. And when Elijah was once again assured that he was loved, that he was appreciated, and God had a place for him, Elijah went back to work. And he enjoyed more years of fruitful service for the God who called him. Lessons for us. Remember Elijah. The future may look daunting. The present may get us down. But there's a God who knows us. There's a God who loves us. There's a God who has plans for us to be his servant and to do his will. What more can you ask for in life than that? To serve God is a means to satisfaction, pleasure even, and to be of wonderful service to our God. Thank you for listening today, and I pray that you will join us again next week when we continue on. Till then, may God bless you richly.